PTE Talks là chuỗi tọa đàm trực tuyến nằm trong khuôn khổ hợp tác giữa Viện ISB, Đại học Kinh tế Thành phố Hồ Chí Minh với Pearson, PTE Academic và Báo VnExpress. Bắt đầu từ ngày 1 tháng 7 năm 2022, quy tụ 10 diễn giả là các chuyên gia về PTE tại Pearson, các nhà quản lý giáo dục tại đại học top 1% thế giới và các thí sinh đạt điểm cao trong kỳ thi PTE Academic. 4 chủ đề mới nhất về PTE và tiếng Anh du học. PTE mở rộng cánh cửa du học đại học top 1% thế giới, công nghệ mới trong dạy, học và khảo thí tiếng Anh, chiến lược chinh phục kỳ thi PTE, kinh nghiệm thực chiến kỳ thi PTE. Chuỗi tọa đàm giúp các bạn có cái nhìn rõ hơn về tầm quan trọng của kỳ thi PTE khi xét tuyển vào đại học hàng đầu thế giới, hiểu rõ về ứng dụng công nghệ AI trong khảo thí tiếng Anh quốc tế và chiến thuật luyện thi PTE hiệu quả. Đăng ký tham dự chuỗi tọa đàm PTE Talks ngay! Xin được chào đón quý vị độc giả đang theo dõi chuỗi tọa đàm PTE Talks. Thưa quý vị, cũng giống như các lĩnh vực khác trong cuộc sống, giáo dục hiện nay đang được thừa hưởng rất nhiều từ sự phát triển nhanh chóng và mạnh mẽ của công nghệ hiện đại. Vì vậy, có thể khẳng định công nghệ cao hiện nay đang đóng một vai trò rất là thiết yếu và là mục tiêu hướng tới của mọi nền giáo dục nói chung và các chương trình khảo thí tiếng Anh nói riêng. Trong đó thì PTE là một ví dụ điển hình khi là bài thi tiếng Anh được chấp nhận rộng rãi toàn cầu và được chấm điểm hoàn toàn bằng công nghệ. Để giúp độc giả có thể hiểu hơn về vai trò của công nghệ trong cuộc sống của các bạn trẻ, trong nhu cầu công việc trong tương lai, trong việc học ngoại ngữ cũng như là hiểu về nguyên lý chấm điểm tự động bằng AI của kỳ thi PTE, xin mời quý vị độc giả cùng đón xem tập 2 của chuỗi PTE Talks ngày hôm nay với chủ đề Công nghệ cao trong dạy, học và khảo thí tiếng Anh. Trước khi bước vào buổi trò chuyện, xin mời quý vị cùng đón xem video giới thiệu các vị diễn giả sẽ xuất hiện ngày hôm nay nhé.
Ông David Booth, Giám đốc phát triển sản phẩm Pearson PTE. Ông có 10 năm kinh nghiệm làm việc tại Cambridge ISO, Cambridge Assessment, từng làm việc tại Hội đồng Anh Hàn Quốc, Hồng Kông và Malaysia. Ông là một chuyên gia dày dạn kinh nghiệm trong lĩnh vực khảo thí, đánh giá năng lực, quản lý học thuật và giảng dạy đào tạo giảng viên. Thạc sĩ về giáo dục tại Viện Giáo dục Đại học London và là thành viên của Viện Marketing Charter. Tiến sĩ Pamela Humphries, Giám đốc Macquarie University College, Australia, đảm nhiệm vai trò giám sát các chương trình ngôn ngữ tiếng Anh, chương trình TESOL, các trung tâm khảo thí IELTS và Pearson, đồng thời là giám đốc của trung tâm Macquarie EMI. Tiến sĩ Pamela đã làm việc trong lĩnh vực giáo dục quốc tế hơn 30 năm ở châu Âu, châu Á và châu Úc. Năm 2016, luận án tiến sĩ của Pamela đã giành được giải thưởng đóng góp xuất sắc cho giáo dục quốc tế của IEAA. Năm 2021, Pamela được trao giải thưởng English Australia John Gallagher Bursary cho những đóng góp xuất sắc trong lĩnh vực Anh ngữ. Bà là thành viên cấp cao của Học viện Giáo dục Đại học, thành viên cấp cao của IEAA, chuyên gia TESA, thành viên Hội đồng Quản trị NIES và là thành viên của Hội đồng Quản trị UECA.
Hello David and Pamela, thank you for being here with us today. Could you share with us what you do in your role as well as the journey that brought you to where you are right now?
Sure. Shall I go first? So I'm the director of Macquarie University College, where I take care of all of the pathway programs into Macquarie University. So diplomas, undergraduate certificates, foundation, and English language. And my journey, my journey started quite a long time ago. I first graduated from a Bachelor of Modern Languages in the UK, and I decided that I wanted to travel the world and avoid a career for a while. So I was very fortunate that I was able to go and live and work in a number of countries, in 5 countries in Europe and then in Asia, where I taught English, TESOL or ESL. And eventually the career caught up with me anyway when I was in Asia. And I was heavily involved in teaching, then teacher training, language assessment and examiner training for many, many years. And then in 2003, I migrated to Australia. And I transitioned away from just English language to working in higher education. And since that time, I've been very lucky to work in 3 universities in Australia. And as I said, now I look after a range of pathway programs in higher education, as well as English language. And along the way, I've accumulated a few qualifications in teaching, a master's in linguistics. And then I did a PhD, which looked at, focused on English language in higher education. And so the areas that I'm particularly interested in now, still language assessment is one of my areas of professional interest, but also English as a medium of instruction, or EMI, and academic language and learning is also another area that I'm very interested in.
Thank you, Pamela. How about David?
Yes, actually, strangely, I have a similar path to Pamela in terms of my early career. So yes, I was a teacher, also did a lot of teacher training. I worked across Asia for the British Council. I worked in Hong Kong for a long time, Malaysia, South Korea. And then I returned to the United Kingdom, where I took up a job with Cambridge. That job was based around assessment, so language assessment, in particular English language assessment. And there I developed computer-based tests, for example, some adaptive computer-based testing applications, and other educational technology that enables good language assessment, things that we are likely to talk about today. My current role is similar to that. I work at Pearson and I'm the test development director, and my job is to develop materials, develop tests, which are basically computer-based tests, and all the things that go with that, related to computer-based delivery, computer-based scoring, and reporting all the results again over the internet and through technology. So my role really is that interface between assessment, good assessment, high quality assessment, and technology that delivers that.
Amazing. You both have rich experience in teaching and developing sophisticated projects in English learning and testing and teaching. I can't wait to jump into our discussion today. But before that, I have a question for Pamela. PT has global popularity, and Pearson has a strong collaboration with top universities worldwide. And Pamela, I've seen a Bigger World video on Pearson's website featuring Macquarie University and you. So could you share with us more about the partnership between Pearson and Macquarie?
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about Macquarie. As you said, Pearson has collaboration with a number of top universities, and Macquarie is in the top 1% of universities globally. And our Department of Linguistics specifically is ranked number 27 in the world for linguistics and languages and TESOL. So we're very fortunate that we have that at the university. And the English Language Centre and our testing centres have a very close collaboration with our Department of Linguistics as well. And more recently, we've become known for some of our MOOCs and our collaboration with PTE. So in terms of the partnership that you mentioned, yeah, myself and the college have a very strong professional relationship with the Pearson team, actually, especially the ones in Asia Pacific. As well as the Bigger World campaign that you mentioned earlier. So my team have been recipients of Pearson Awards over the years, including ones that recognize contribution to best practice in the sector. Myself personally, I've had the pleasure of opening not one but 2 PTE test centers in the last 15 years or so, I think. In 2018, I was also invited to be a member of a small team of language specialists in Asia Pacific who were involved in some research that Pearson were doing to set the standard for PTE. And then I think the collaboration was formalized really when we made a formal partnership with Pearson in 2019, which coincided with the launch of our PTE test center at Macquarie University. And that led to further opportunities, including a bigger world, but perhaps importantly, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it today in the session, in 2020, we were able to partner again with Pearson to develop a test preparation course or a MOOC, which we developed on the FutureLearn platform, and this focused on the speaking component of the PTE test. So what we were really happy about is that we were able to work not just with the FutureLearn team, but also with the Pearson team to make sure that the content of our test preparation MOOC really accurately reflected the content of the test requirements. And in my view, one of the reasons that our test preparation course has been so successful is because of that collaboration. And we've seen thousands of students take that preparation course with very high satisfaction rates. So I really put that down to the collaboration with the Pearson team.
Okay, so back to our topic today, which is modern technologies. We have witnessed the fast advance of tech when almost every industry and sector are applying high-tech tools and big data infrastructures. So in your opinion, David, how has modern tech like big data and artificial intelligence changed the way businesses operate and the skills they need in their people?
Yes, a very good question. I think it's probably not a simple answer, but certainly in terms of the way that businesses operate, I think there's been some major changes in that. The point of AI, and I think people will probably understand this, is it kind of brings together three important elements, which is the data, the fact that there's so much more data in the world now and people are collecting that data. Then the power of the computers. Computers are so much more powerful than when I was teaching 20 years ago. The computers were powerful enough, but nowadays you carry in your hand, a phone which has got more computing power than those computers had. And then the algorithms which are being developed, which are complex computer programs. So businesses are very much aware of this. And so when a business is looking at how can they get the competitive edge, how can they be more successful than other businesses in their sector, they look at these three things and try and use them for the advantage of the company. So a good example is data. And you see this all the time in your daily life, really, where companies are collecting data in real time. So, for example, when you use the internet or when you use social media, then the companies are looking at what social media sites you're looking at, what sites you're looking at to buy things, what you're trying to buy. So, for example, say I wanted to visit Pamela next year in Australia, which I'm sure she'll be happy to invite me to Australia. Then I would look online and find a flight, what's the cheapest flight I can get to Sydney. And then the computer, that data, that bit of information is being passed into a computer somewhere, put into an algorithm. David wants to go to Australia. So then I will see in my Facebook feed advertisements for flights and hotels in Australia, in Sydney. So business has changed quite dramatically, I think, over the last 10 or 20 years in trying to exploit this data, and also the movement, and we can't not mention the pandemic, but the movement of people online and you doing more and more things online also has quickened that change, I think. So lots and lots of people now buy very basic things online, like groceries and other things. So again, the computer programs are looking at their profile, seeing what they're buying. Do they buy soup, for example? And in which case, then the businesses will be looking to sell them more soup. So I think the changes in business are there, and they will increase. And there'll be further changes which will impact on education, because education tends to be behind businesses in many ways in terms of transformation and technological transformation. But I think it will certainly happen more in education. Your second question was about people's roles in work. So, how do roles change because of this? Now, clearly, there are new roles. There are data specialists. There are people for it, and data is important. So data protection is important. So companies like Pearson, for example, have to safeguard information that their customers give them. So there's new roles in data analytics, data protection, in software development, app development. There's lots of new roles. Marketing has changed. A lot of marketing now is online, but still there are some traditional roles which are required within a company. So a good example is specialist roles related, in my case, to assessment. You still need specialists who know about testing. You still need project managers. You still need teachers. So there are many roles which are still the same despite the changes in technology. So I think, yeah, people have to get ready for that, and there may be a new role that somebody takes, or they may take a more traditional role. Those will still exist, doctors and nurses, etc. Jobs which technology is a big part of, but it's not the major part of that role.
Thank you, David. Even though technology doesn't replace human completely, but the future of jobs, as we see it, is certainly heavily influenced by high tech. So I would like to ask Pamela how universities, like Times universities such as Macquarie, prepare students for this demand from the workforce.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And I completely agree with David that universities can tend to be a little bit behind. But certainly employability has become an absolutely critical graduate capability and is a real focus of universities at the moment. And certainly that's the case at Macquarie. So I'll give you a few answers to your question, actually. I'll start generally and then I'll come specific. So generally, what universities try to do is to partner with industry when they're designing their degree courses or their specific units or subjects, so that they can ensure that they are preparing students for the future world of work, for their professional life, including competence in technology, because as David said, it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous, you can't avoid it. Another thing that universities do is have a focus on work integrated learning, sometimes called WIL. At Macquarie, we have a different name for this. We call it PACE, which stands for Professional and Community Engagement. And actually at Macquarie, every single bachelor degree has a built-in unit. It's a requirement. They have to take this unit of PACE so that every single bachelor student at Macquarie gets this practical hands-on experience in an organization towards the latter end of their degree. And actually this has resulted in Macquarie being ranked #1 in Sydney for its graduate employability. So employability is really quite key. But I think there's another thing that universities can do, and I'll give some examples from Macquarie, and that is to consider emerging fields. So as David said, you need specialists, absolutely. You mentioned cybersecurity, David, and we have degrees at Macquarie in cybersecurity, and the number of people who are taking that has just ballooned in the last few years. And next year, Macquarie is launching a couple of specializations in its Masters of IT, one of which is AI specifically, and one in the Internet of Things. So that's an example of how universities change their product offerings for the future and emerging fields and disciplines. But another thing that we're seeing, and this picks up on what David was saying, that even in areas where you're not a specialist, you still need technology and IT skills. So for example, at the college where I work, we've developed a suite of diplomas that actually merge IT and something else. So we have a diploma in business analytics that merges business and IT. We are about to launch one in game design and development, which kind of merges IT and media, and another one that's software engineering that merges IT and engineering. So I think the future is actually going to be a combination of skills. Another thing that universities do is increasingly is to offer micro credentials or short courses in tech. An example from Macquarie, we have 4 courses in Excel on the Coursera platform, which hundreds of thousands of people have taken. So obviously that was something that was very popular to upskill people in that very critical area of tech. But I think generally what universities are doing is recognizing that everybody needs digital literacies. So what we're doing across degrees now is embedding digital literacies across the degree, across the course in specific subjects, and recognizing that IT and knowledge of data is now a standard literacy requirement, and it's not just for specialists, so that our students are ready to graduate with that requisite skill set. So I'll just give an example. David mentioned buying, groceries online, for example. And one of the things that we've done in our foundation program, which is kind of a year 12 alternative, we have a unit called Digital Intelligence, and it aims to do things, exactly that kind of things, the digital literacies needed for everyday life, like buying your groceries online. And another thing that we do at the end of degrees, for example, in the Bachelor of Commerce, we have a capstone unit, so one of the units at the end of degrees, where students are required to use Canva, LinkedIn, Portfolio, Padlet, this whole range of different skills and tech to streamline their teamwork and their project that they're working on together in the final semester of their study. So I think universities are definitely reacting to this and trying to keep up to date with preparing students for the realities of the future, including IT and tech.
Well, that's impressive. Well, I certainly can see that universities are responding pretty well to the need of the future of jobs. And I can see that regardless of the fields we choose for our career, we need to be familiar with technologies to enhance our employability. So I think those are what's going on the business side. How about the personal life of individuals? Is it still a long way to go before ordinary people like me need to bother with high technology like AI and stuff on my daily life? What do you think of that, David?
And I think ordinary people are using AI in their daily lives today. For example, just searches on the internet. I mean, that's basically AI powered. I mean, they cannot get the answer to you on one of your searches in a matter of less than a second if they didn't have the AI technology there, if they didn't have the algorithms, the data, and the computing power to do that. Other examples, I mean, some of us in our homes have got speakers or got machines which will answer questions, tell you the weather, tell you what you should be doing, tell you the time of the next train. I mean, those machines are becoming more common. Similarly, robots. I mean, people may or may not have seen, I mean, there's some simple robots which just clean the floor, but there are other more complex robots and other uses of AI for example, in railway stations, giving you information about the next train or give you information about where you should go if you want to do certain things. So as we move around the world and as we see, as we in our daily lives move around our own cities or move around other cities, we do see the application of AI quite a lot. Recently, I went, well, I say recently, it was probably about 2 or 3 years ago. I went to China, and there you could see again the application of AI technology, face recognition, for example. So I went into one company, and they showed me, it told me how attractive I was. So it gave me a score on an attractiveness scale. Now, I don't think this is necessarily a good idea, but certainly in language testing, for example, we use similar technology to rate people's ability in speaking and writing, but it's not necessarily related to their attractiveness.
Thank you. So how about people talking with machines like Siri's?
Talking to machines or interacting with machines, I mean, it's not just talking. I think it's relatively common. I mean, if you say interacting with a machine, I mean, another good example, which coming into customer service in a lot of companies, is chatbots. So if you've got a problem with a particular product that you've bought, or you've got an issue, you go online, then you end up starting to talk to a machine. And sometimes, I know it's not always, but sometimes that machine can actually solve your problem. Sometimes it can't, and then it might send you to a human being. But the first line of customer service for a lot of companies now is offering automated chat. And then after the automated chat, you'll move into, if that's not resolved your problem and the company's well organized, you might go to a human being to sort out your problem. But yes, I mean, certainly interacting with machines either through chats or through voice, is relatively commonplace.
Wow. So that in the future, it's not only the conversation between human and human, but there's certainly a need for conversation between human and machines.
I'm a great fan of science fiction. And the one thing about science fiction is that most of science fiction is rubbish and will never happen. But some of it does happen. And certainly I can see communication between humans and machines being quite important. But possibly the next 50 years or so. But who wants to make a prediction really on that basis? But certainly the evidence of today is that machines will become more important in our lives, and communicating with those machines in whatever way it happens will be something that we need to think about.
Right. Thank you, David and Pamela. Now let's move on to the next section. According to the World Economic Forum's The Future of Jobs Report 2020, globally, AI is expected to replace 85 million jobs and create 97 million new jobs by 2025. Pamela, what do you think will happen in education? Will high-tech replace human teachers?
That's a good question. If I have to answer just yes or no, I would say the answer is no. Although it's a little bit more complicated than that. But let's say no for now, and that's a couple of reasons why. Firstly, human beings are very social animals, and we like and actively seek out authentic human connection. That's important to us. But also, I would base it on research. I don't know if you or your listeners are aware of an educational researcher called Professor John Hattie, who undertook a meta-analysis of a huge amount of educational research that had been done on all levels of education. And he looked at all the different variables that impact student outcomes. And the only significant, well, not the only significant, the biggest impact, the most statistically significant impact was the teacher. So a teacher has a very positive impact on learning. And for that reason, I think that the teacher, the human teacher, is never going to be completely replaced. I mean, obviously, AI is improving all the time, and there are ways to manage online asynchronous learning that we'll talk about later, actually. But I don't think it's ever going to completely replace a human. So there are things that a human can do that technology, certainly at the moment, cannot. A human teacher can react to a learner's response in terms of not just the content that they're learning, but also their attitude and how they're feeling at a particular time. So are they feeling upset, discouraged? Do they need motivating? Do they need some positive reinforcement? And that's difficult to do if you're not a human. And a human can assess all of those things and respond appropriately. And this is particularly important for children, I think. It's not impossible, but I think it's difficult at the moment. The other reason is that at the moment, and again, I realize that AI is improving all the time, but at the moment, popular tech tools can only provide a fairly surface level feedback. For example, they can give feedback on your spelling or your punctuation, your grammar, maybe your pronunciation. But most of the feedback at the moment is still very much at the sentence level. It's not really at larger whole text level, the coherence, the cohesion, the actual underlying meaning of language. And language is more than just a collection of words and grammar. It's not just about accurate sentences. So at the moment, that level of sophistication is kind of hard to replicate with tech in isolation from a teaching and learning perspective. And I'm sure David will have some comments on that later. But anyway, I don't think it's an either or, though. I don't think it's teacher or tech. I think the future will actually be how we can integrate the advantages of a real life teacher with the advantages of AI. I don't think it's one or the other, but about leveraging the advantages of each for best effect. So in my view, technology provides the tools that are supplementary, complementary, but that don't substitute a human teacher. So tech is the enabler, if you like.
Thank you, Pamela. David, do you want to add on something?
Yes, yeah, I agree with a lot of what Pamela says, and I think the importance of research can't be underestimated. The work that Hattie did absolutely showed that teachers were the key people in terms of giving feedback to students, and that immediate feedback is the most effective. I think I think it's not really about technology in terms of getting the sophistication of feedback and getting and really trying to work out what is the best way of helping students learn. I think the teachers are in a very good position to do that, but also tech can support them. And what we have done, which is related to this, is we developed something called the Global Scale of English. And this actually came out of PT Academic. And it's not about the surface features that Pamela mentioned, grammar and vocabulary. It's more about what you can do with the language. So when people do a test, then they exhibit certain behaviors, and those behaviors are scored by that test, and we can see what people can do well and what people can do less well. So tech enables you then to feed that back to the teacher and the student about what they did well and what they did less well in terms of their language performance. So this is the way in which technology is developing. But absolutely, the final interface is the teacher, and the teacher is the only one who can work with students to provide the motivation they need to understand the kinds of things they need to improve their level of language ability. And this is both for students who perhaps are a little bit weaker than others, so students who need to catch up a little bit, and also for those students who actually perform well. In my knowledge of the classroom, when you're in the classroom and you've got a student and they're doing very well and they're always getting the good marks, then you go, oh, that's great, fine, thank you, it's great. And you kind of ignore them, when in fact you shouldn't. What you should do is try to give them opportunities to extend their learning. If they're a good student, keep pushing them. And again, technology can do this, because what you want with feedback and what you want with technology is to kind of personalize that experience, to try to give feedback direct to the student. This is what you could do better. This is how you could improve. And I agree with Pamela precisely that it's not a one size fits all. It's a mixture of these things, but the teacher is absolutely key to enabling that feedback, the motivation, and the human side of language learning.
Now, from your observation, what could be the future of tech in this area of teaching and learning English? What are the eminent technologies, the trends?
Yeah, I think Pamela's pointed that out to some extent. The feedback loop has to become more sophisticated, and it has a place, particularly in those courses that Pamela was describing, where you're not interacting directly with a person in real time. Where you're doing things in your own time, which is actually how people want to learn. So people want to learn in their homes in the evening, or people want to do some practice when they are on a bus, for example, going to work. Then the technology is developing to enable that. So it's not just that you learn things in the classroom. So technology allows you to learn things all the time. You don't have to be in a classroom. You don't have to be reading a book or doing something on a computer even. You can do things on your phone. So I think what we will find, one of the technologies, and it is there to an extent, but it will develop, I think, is the use of the mobile phone. So more and more we find educational technology that can be accessed very simply and easily. And that's certainly one of the emerging technologies. I think the other element is, as I said, the sophistication of feedback. So we've got to look further than just grammar and vocabulary. And if you do look, and people can look online and they look at tests, and I mean, I don't want to encourage this, but say you put into Google free English test, and you search for some English tests which are low cost or free, what you'll find there is tests which are just purely testing grammar and vocabulary, and not really testing the richness of language. You know, language is not about grammar and vocabulary per se. Language is about communication with other human beings, empathy, you know, building a relationship with somebody else. That's what language is supposed to do. So as technology becomes more advanced, then these are the things that it will help learners to develop. And certainly the way that Pearson are working, particularly in writing, and it was interesting what Pamela was saying about evaluating writing and evaluating just the surface features. And I think that is true of certain language assessments. But what we're trying to do is develop a deeper type of analysis of somebody's writing, which focuses not on the grammar and vocabulary, but on meaning, but also using machine learning. So instead of me as a human being saying to the computer program, oh, look for this, look for that, look for the other, look for correct grammar, look for the correct vocabulary, the machine now is deciding what it should look for in terms of what makes something a good piece of writing. And there's interesting discussions, in the media, but also in academic circles, about whether this is a good or a bad thing. And certainly we can talk about that. But machines more and more will develop those language skills, which for a long time we felt only humans could actually do.
Right. And Pamela, would you like to add in something?
Sure. I mean, I completely agree with what David was saying about machine learning. I mean, Pearson have made good use of that in the PTE, but I think machine learning is probably going to come in to teaching as well, and it's becoming more and more sophisticated all the time. Just a comment about all of this technology, though. I think it's really important that learners learn to make judgments about what the tech is telling you. So we're going to need to train students to be able to critically analyze the output that some of these apps and tech give you. So I think definitely machine learning. Another thing is something that David mentioned earlier on, actually, and I feel that the future is probably for more adaptive content delivery. It's been possible in testing for a while, but I think, again, in teaching and learning, adaptive content is where the computer is able to decide when the learner is ready for something more complicated, so that you don't have to take the same journey as somebody who is still struggling with some particular content. You could skip some content or go more quickly. So I think adaptive content delivery that's based on individual learners' responses is probably also going to be of the future, and that will be very data driven.
Okay, so assessment is an important part of learning. What is the role of testing in assessment, and in the past, how has tech contributed to this aspect?
Oh, that's a really big question to me. Assessment is a very kind of broad term, and testing is just one component, one subcomponent of that. So we could talk about different kinds of testing. So we could talk about high stakes testing, like PTE, for example, low stakes testing. Language testers talk about formative and summative testing as well. And tech can certainly support all of these different forms and uses for sure. In high stakes language testing, we talked about machine scoring, and this has been able to help with the quick marking of multiple choice questions for many, many years, decades perhaps. But obviously English language assessment can't just rely on simple questions like the MCQ. So the challenge has always been, how do you use technology particularly for the productive skills, by which I mean speaking and writing. So they're arguably the most challenging to assess reliably and practically. Typically, we've had human examiners who've marked speaking and writing. And we either need to train a human examiner or we need to train a computer. But either way, it's expensive to do that. and it's expensive to assess. It takes a long time to train an exam, and it takes a long time to train a computer, or at least a lot of input to train the computer. Pronunciation as a particular subcomponent of that is quite challenging to assess with technology, and it raises a lot of issues around, well, who makes the decision as to what pronunciation is acceptable? Does it have to be a native speaker pronunciation? Whose English is acceptable? And that brings up ideas around world Englishes and English as a lingua franca, as we've kind of shifted our thinking away from the need to sound like a native speaker. So generally speaking, I would say that in the past, the role of tech has been quite limited until recently.
Yeah, right. And David, what's your take on that?
Yes, I agree with some of what Pamela says. I mean, I like the analogy of train the human and train the machine. I think that's a very, very, very true in some senses. And I'll go on to say exactly what I mean by that. But what we have had, and again, Pamela says, typically language exams, and that's my area of where I work. So, but typically language exams have used human assessors, people, to assess other people's speaking and writing. And that in itself has a host of problems. I mean, in terms of another person assessing you, then you have to deal with the inherent biases that other person has when they come to assess your English language capability and ability. But also, of course, if you've got exams on the scale, these high stakes exams, of Pearson being one of them, they're taken by tens of thousands of people a month. So if you want to have examiners, you can't just have one examiner. You've got to have 20 examiners, 30 examiners, 100 examiners. And these tests are global, they're taken all over the world. So you've got to have hundreds, if not thousands, of examiners based in 150 countries around the world. And then you've got to, as Pamela rightly says, train all of those examiners. But even when you've trained them, you still don't know that they're going to give accurate scores. So even though all the examiners have gone through the same training, they will not give the same scores as each other for the same student. So there's variability in terms of how the examiner is scored. And sometimes, and people may have seen this on the internet, people will say, oh, if you go to this country, it's easier to get a high score because the examiner is more lenient. The examiner is easier to, will give you a better score than you perhaps deserve. So, I mean, that's not ideal. Similarly, I mean, I've been an examiner. Pamela's been an examiner for many years. And you know that if you get up in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, as it is for me today, then you feel great. You're interacting. You're willing, loving to talk to people. Love to meet a few students today. You're in a positive frame of mind. But come 8, 9, 10 o'clock, then you're getting a bit tired. Maybe you're not as happy as you were in the morning. Maybe you won't give exactly the same score as you would have done So humans, we're human, and it's not. There's a problem with examiners. It's just that examiners generally human. I mean, there's another common feature, and Pamela talked about assessment of pronunciation. So, for example, when a student does a test, the examiner will have in front of them, they'll have a bit of paper like this, and on that paper will be criteria that they're using to score that particular student. So, for example, the first thing they score is their pronunciation. Okay, pronunciation, not bad. I'll give them 4 out of 5. The next thing they score is fluency. Oh, 4 out of 5. The next thing they do is vocabulary. Oh, 4 out of 5. We are, by our nature, human beings are not good at using those kind of scales. And the first score we give often impacts on the scores we give later. So I think training the human to score is is actually a very, very difficult thing, and something that I've been involved with over the years, and Pamela's been involved with, and and credit to those people who have implemented those systems over the years and got people, examined and trained in all those countries around the world, and quite a system was needed to be built up to do that. I mean, the difference with training a machine is that once the machine is trained, then it's consistent. It will give the same score to that person over and over again, based on their performance. It won't give them a score of 4 in the morning and 6 in the evening, or the other way around. It will give them a score of 5 and then 5. So it will give a consistent score. It doesn't matter the time of day. It doesn't matter who the student is. And also, interesting point that Pamela raised about, whose English are we testing? World English, which is difficult to define. Let's be honest. We all know of different standards of English, and you may think of American English, you may think of British English, you may think of Australian English, and even then defining the standard is very, very difficult. What do we mean by that? So when the machines are being trained, then the important thing is to have a wide sample of different types of Englishes. So not obviously predominantly people who are speaking English who are learning the language. So we're not interested in native speaker competence, whatever that might be. We're interested in people who've learnt the language, normally as a second or third language, and how good their English is. So we want to compare them with other similar students. So what you can do, I mean, if you have a human examiner, the human examiner is often using their own standard. And Pamela must have seen this, where, a student uses a piece of vocabulary, or uses some American terminology, and the examiner is from a different background, say, then they may not appreciate that different use of language. The machine doesn't care. The machine doesn't care if you use American English, Australian English, Indian English. It as long as the sample, and this is where the potential weakness comes, as long as the sample that's being collected is sufficient, as long as the data that the machine has got is sufficient, then it's a better way of testing than the human being. Now, I put that caveat in there because it's very true that it's not just a simple thing. You have to develop a lot of data. You need to collect a lot of data across a lot of different students, different nationalities, different levels of performance. So you need hundreds, if not thousands, of examples. And that is in itself actually a very difficult and a very expensive thing to do. So developing these models to do scoring and marking of speaking and writing is not an easy thing. It's something that we do, and it's something that other companies definitely are moving into. And I know Pamela goes to conferences and talks around the world about assessment, and there more and more you find the specialists and the technology people talking about how they're using machines more and more for this particular purpose. So yes, certainly something that will develop further, I think, in the future.
So could you share more about how has technology has finally came to the breakthrough in terms of in this aspect?
Pamela referred to multiple choice testing and the use of computers for multiple choice. And that's a fairly simple technology. It's basically a machine that can just read what you put on an answer sheet, generally speaking, A, B, C, or D. Technology then was developed in order to read students' writing. So students would write a short response to a question, and then the technology was developed so that it could actually read the words that the student had written. But this technology wasn't particularly effective. And I think it's not being used very widely because, again, too much error in terms of not recognizing the words that the students have written. I think the breakthrough really came, and it's not in education, but really through voice recognition technology. And a lot of this was based around office work, and particularly in the legal field. So in the legal field, a lot of what lawyers would do was actually record. They would actually speak into a speaker and record on tape or on digital recording notes or letters, and then these were later transcribed by somebody on, written down. So somebody had to sit and listen to this and write it down. And I think technology people thought, well, what if a machine could, at least translate half of that, or at least translate, 50, 60% of that. So these voice recognition technologies came in. They also helped people with disabilities, for example. So people who weren't able to type were able to actually use their voice in order to put words onto a screen. So people, so it had applications both in professional circles, but also to help with disability, or to help with certain incapacitations that people had. And this technology, the being able to transcribe speech into writing in an automatic way, is what actually powers our speaking assessment. So the main focus in terms of seeing whether or not the content of what somebody has said is appropriate uses the speech recognition technology. The other technology, and again, Pamela mentioned pronunciation. In fact, machines are very, very skilled at analyzing stretches of speech. So, for example, if you looked at what I'm saying now, what's being recorded, if you went into the studio, you would see a digital imprint of what I'm saying, and you would see the pauses that I'm making, the volume that I'm speaking at, if it's higher or lower. You can see, or you can analyze the actual sounds that the people are making, and you can focus on some of the critical sounds, some of those sounds which make the difference between communicating effectively and not communicating effectively. So technology is actually quite attuned at looking at things in detail, much more than the human. The human being, if they were listening to somebody, couldn't actually identify the actual sounds that somebody's making that maybe are not correct. And in terms of writing, similarly, the focus on writing is not on the surface structure, as we would say in linguistics, the grammar and the vocabulary, but on meaning. So machines now are being trained to focus on the meaning that people are expressing in their writing. The fact that people can express meaning in different ways is accounted for. Again, the focus is on collecting a lot of information and data from other people and how other people have answered the question, and then seeing, how that relates to a good answer. What makes a good answer? What makes a not so good answer? What makes a relatively weak answer? So the machine decides what elements of the writing, what things that the person has done in their writing. And it may be, for example, the vocabulary that they use, the level of vocabulary. It may be the structure of the text that they've written. Do they have topic sentences? Do they have paragraphs? It may be the length of sentences that the student has written. So the longer the sentence, in theory, the more complex the language that's being used. But the machine will identify within a particular set of responses what were the things that made that particular piece of writing better than the other piece of writing. And it may be a combination of those things. It may be one or two or three or four. We don't know from the assessment angle. We haven't told the machine what it should look for. The machine has decided itself based on the data that it's been given. So that is, in a very narrow sense, the kind of machine learning. And as Pamela mentioned in earlier, machine learning is becoming more and more important in learning, teaching and learning, in terms of personalization. But the example I'm giving is just how it's used in high stakes testing.
You has talked a lot about how machine has been developed, David, in English assessment or in in testing. So as the Director of Test Development of PTE, could you shed some light on how the technology behind PTE works, especially for the production skills?
Yeah, I think I've covered a lot of that, in what I've just said previously. The focus of in terms of assessing speaking, and in fact, I think the most important thing to say is that, in terms of the assessment of speaking, we still use human resources. We still use human examiners. So when each item that is developed has to be trained separately by the assessment engines. So for example, say we have one of our items is a repeat sentence. So when we're looking at that repeat sentence, what we will do is get samples of people who have repeated that sentence, and good examples and less good examples. So we have to cover the whole of the scoring range to make sure that the assessment engine knows what makes a good response to that particular question. Now, for example, in that example, we are also able to break down exactly what the person says in terms of, for example, the time it took them to say that. Also, the pauses, how much, for example, the person paused during their response to that particular sentence. Now, the more that they paused with a gap, with a silence, then that would indicate a less fluent speaker. If though you pause, and when you pause, you tend to fill those pauses either with, for example, what we call fillers like or repetition. So for example, saying fill, 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 that actually, although it's pausing, and although it's taking you the same time as the person who said the sentence with those silences, is not an indication of lower proficiency. It's actually an indication of reasonably high proficiency. So the machine has to think about, what is going on? Is it silent pauses that it is and a long turn, or is it filled pauses? So that's what part of what the technology is doing, evaluating the skill of that particular speaker based on the length of their utterance and the pauses that they make. And that will give you a score, for example, for fluency. And similarly for pronunciation, we'll look at individual pronunciation of particular phonemes. So phonemes are the sounds like ch and th and g and p and b. Now, it's not so simple as because depending on whether that sound is at the beginning of a word or the end of a word might change the quality of that sound. In some languages, for example, they are not used to putting the sounds at the ends of the words. So, most of the sounds and the stress is at the beginning. A lot of languages, sounds are individual sounds, not pulled together like they might be in English. They're not what we call multisyllabic, a number of different syllables in a word. So the machine has to understand, what are those sounds and how am I expected to hear them and in what order? But this is what a machine can do. A machine can actually say, yes, out of all those sounds that I expected to hear, 80% of those sounds were there. 20% were not there. Therefore, give them a score. So, the speaking technology is, based around an analysis of that particular content, and also looking at did the person say what they were supposed to say. Now, the speaking technologies rely to an extent on what we call predictability. So you'll get, for example, questions which just ask you to repeat something or read something out. And then you'll get questions asking you to describe something. So for example, describe a picture like we have next to me here. Okay. Then, of course, some of that is quite predictable. The computer will expect to hear can, tomato soup, Campbell's, it's a picture, it's red, it's yellow, it's green. So, those are the predictable elements that the computer is expecting to hear. And that is, as this technology develops, the computer can actually deal with more and more unpredictable commentary. Okay, so for example, if the person knew that these pictures were by a particular artist, then they may start their conversation, they may start their description with that. You know, I think those are pictures by Andy Warhol. I think they're famous because he painted cans of soup hundreds of times in many, many different colors. So some of it is predictable, some of it is less predictable. And again, as the technology develops, then it's, you know, more and more we'll be able to work with the less predictable responses.
Wow, amazing. So it is all about anticipation of responses and pulling out from a very big data of test takers to get into the real meaning of their responses.
Yes, and just like Pamela said, it's training the machine. But what's happening more and more, and particularly with our writing assessments, it's the machine training itself. You give the machine the data, and then it decides what it is that's important. So we're moving away from prescriptiveness, if you want, where, you know, the highest person in the hierarchy says what something is worth or what the value of something is. And that's how, to be honest with you, how examiner training works. You don't make individual decisions. Whoever is the highest person in the hierarchy tells you what that decision should be, and then you have to train yourself to agree with it. With machines, then the machine decides itself, although then that's it, that's the decision, and all test takers, all candidates will be scored using that particular algorithm, using that particular piece of software that the machine has decided is the best way to score that particular utterance. But we have to collect, as you say, a lot of data, and also that data has to be scored by human examiners. So we have a small group of highly trained examiners who do evaluate the data that we have and score that data, because without those scores, the machine cannot actually decide which is the better piece of writing or not. It needs the scores from the humans in order to make that judgment about whether or not this is worth more than the other piece of writing that it's seen. So, you know, even though in high tech, you know, a lot of it, people will say, is a bit of a black box. You don't see the exact workings of the tech. And, you know, to be frank with you, sometimes it's difficult to understand the exact workings of the tech. But we rely on the human element as well to check, to validate. So every time we score a particular item, and we build that model, we train the machine, then we test the machine against the humans. So the machine scoring is tested against the human scoring. And if the correlation, the relationship between those two scores is not high, then we don't use that question. We only use the question where we've got confidence that a good examiner, a highly qualified, highly trained, not very tired, not particularly biased examiner would give that score. And if we're convinced that that's true, then those test questions go into the test.
Right, thank you. And now that we know that the machine look for the meaning of the responses from test takers, and the results are validated by human examiners, do you have any advice to perform well when taking a high-stake test scored by AI like PTE?
Sure. Actually, my advice to test takers, and look, I've had a lot of experience teaching and running webinars and all sorts of test taker support over the years. My advice is always the same, regardless of the test, regardless of the country. I find that test takers make a number of mistakes and waste resources. So I'm going to first suggest a few things that they should not do. If you take a high stakes test a couple of times, because of course we might be not feeling particularly well on the day, we have a bad day. But if you've taken a test twice, maybe 3 times at most, and you've got a similar score and you've not got the score that you need, then I would suggest that you stop taking the test. Don't waste any more money on taking the test. Stop and invest that money on improving your language proficiency, because good tests will give you a very similar score every single time you take it. So that's a message to you that your language proficiency is not at the level that you need it to be to get the score that you need. So my first piece of advice is don't take a test multiple times, more than 2 or 3 times. Go and improve your language proficiency. Having said that, it is really important, whatever the test is, that you understand the expectations of that test. You know the kinds of questions that you're going to get, because that's certainly going to help you. If you've taken a different test in the past, you're going to be shocked if you come and do PTE, all right? It's a different test. It's your responsibility as a test taker to know the kinds of questions, to know the timing of the test, etc., so that there are no surprises. But I would always say, don't try to memorize responses. That is not going to help. You cannot cheat a high quality test like PTE. And there are lots of high quality tests. You cannot cheat them. They are not measuring your memory. They are not measuring your test taking strategies. They are measuring your language proficiency. So that's my don'ts. More positively though, same advice I give to everyone. Take every opportunity that you can to develop your language proficiency. Listen to a wide range of things in English. Read widely in English. Take every opportunity to speak and write. Much more challenging if you're in a country that's not English speaking, but it doesn't need to be with native speakers. Find people who speak English well and take every opportunity you can to develop your language, particularly, and this is another key tip, find out where your weaknesses are. What is it about your language that you need to improve? Is it a particular skill? Maybe it's speaking, maybe it's pronunciation. Whatever it is, work on that. So it's not just about preparing for the test, it's about language proficiency in general. So those are my general tips.
Thank you, Pamela. How about you, David?
Yes, I agree with everything Pamela said. I think the only thing I would say is that it also depends a little bit on the time you've given yourself to prepare for the test. So some people are very good and they think maybe a year or 2 years ahead of doing, oh, I might be studying abroad, or I might need it to go on, on a work visa somewhere. So they make a lot of preparations early. So as Pamela says, improve their general language proficiency. Other people, and we're all like this, sometimes, it's just, oh, I need a test now. So you don't really have, months or years to prepare. So I think, again, some of the things Pamela was saying there, make sure you're familiar with the test content. There's quite a lot of test preparation material out there. Some people there's quite a lot of practice tests. So you shouldn't walk into that testing room not knowing what kind of questions you're going to answer and how you're going to answer them. So there's even, we do a scored practice test. So there's also a test you can do, which will give you an idea of what score you're going to get. It's just an idea. There are tests like that. So again, do what preparation you can, be familiar, but in the long run, yes, it's about your language proficiency. It's not about being able to suddenly get an extra 3 or 4 points or 5 points on a test if your language proficiency doesn't really merit that.
Great, thank you. Pamela and David, thank you for your insights and advice. I believe many of our audience and myself find it very useful. And it's been both an honor and a pleasure talking to you two today. Thank you for spending time with us, and we wish you a very good day ahead.
Thanks, Jimmy. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Vâng, thưa quý vị, và sau những chia sẻ vừa rồi từ phía hai vị khách mời thì chúng ta đều có thể hình dung được sự thay đổi trong việc học khảo thí tiếng Anh hiện nay khi có sự xuất hiện và hỗ trợ của công nghệ cao. Đây có thể coi là xu thế tất yếu mà các nền giáo dục nói chung và các chương trình giảng dạy và khảo thí tiếng Anh nói riêng sẽ đầu tư phát triển. để nhằm giúp người học sớm làm quen với công nghệ hiện đại, đáp ứng và thích nghi hiệu quả hơn với nhu cầu cuộc sống phát triển ngày hôm nay. Và xin cảm ơn quý vị độc giả đã quan tâm theo dõi. Xin chào và hẹn gặp lại quý vị độc giả trong những chương trình lần sau. PTE Talks là chuỗi tọa đàm trực tuyến nằm trong khuôn khổ hợp tác giữa Viện ISB, Đại học Kinh tế Thành phố Hồ Chí Minh với Pearson, PTE Academic và Báo VnExpress. Bắt đầu từ ngày 1 tháng 7 năm 2022, quy tụ 10 diễn giả là các chuyên gia về PTE tại Pearson, các nhà quản lý giáo dục tại đại học top 1% thế giới, và các thí sinh đạt điểm cao trong kỳ thi PTE Academic. 4 chủ đề mới nhất về PTE và tiếng Anh du học. PTE mở rộng cánh cửa du học đại học top 1% thế giới, công nghệ mới trong dạy học và khảo thí tiếng Anh, chiến lược chinh phục kỳ thi PTE, kinh nghiệm thực chiến kỳ thi PTE. Chuỗi tọa đàm giúp các bạn có cái nhìn rõ hơn về tầm quan trọng của kỳ thi PTE khi xét tuyển vào đại học hàng đầu thế giới, hiểu rõ về ứng dụng công nghệ AI trong khảo thí tiếng Anh quốc tế và chiến thuật luyện thi PTE hiệu quả. Đăng ký tham dự chuỗi tọa đàm PTE Talks ngay!